Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
We stopped last time after finishing Luke chapter 21, verse 17. So tonight we're going to start with Luke 21:28 in a few minutes. We spent some time last time discussing some of the theologies that have developed over the last 2,000 years or so with regard to the second coming of Messiah and the kingdom that he's going to initiate, that he's going to build. And we discussed the pre, post, and the amillennialists. These are theories that are taught by various parts of the body of Messiah, and we've, I believe, all been influenced in some way by these because we constantly get to hear them being taught. So let's get started tonight by going to Luke, would you please, chapter 21, verses 26 through 28. It says, as people faint with fear at the prospect of what is overtaking the world, for the powers in heaven will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with tremendous power and glory. When these things start to happen, stand up and hold your head high because you are about to be liberated. Some translations will say things like, your redemption draws nigh. Now, the great apprehension of the last days throws those who have refused to accept Yeshua as Messiah and repent, that throws them into great terror. They're going to wonder, my gosh, what's going on? My world's disintegrating under me. This will be a sign that the final judgment of God is being visited on the earth when this takes place. A sign that this terror is being brought on those who have rejected God's Son. This will be a sign to believers also when these things happen, because we will then know that their full redemption is close at hand. We will then know that our redemption, full redemption, is close at hand. The reaction of the believer at this point is going to be far from terror, but in fact it's going to be like rejoicing. The actual advent of Messiah will be either instantaneous or take place over a very, very short period of time. Yeshua here in this passage is talking to his Talmudim, to his disciples, who represent the faithful of all ages. I want you to kind of build that into your minds. They really represent not only themselves, but all of the faithful that are going to come down through the ages, including those of the last days. Those who live at the time of these last events are really to have knowledge of these words. And that's why we're teaching this so intensely, so that that'll be possible. That we be instilled with the courage that comes from this knowledge and with this faith in Yeshua Messiah, and be able to pass it on to others in the future, if that be the case, that at the second coming, Messiah with his redemption will be right at hand when they see these signs. Those believers that are living at that time, although they will not know the precise time, When the panic is seen setting in among the non-believers, they will know that the redemption is right at hand. That's going to be a trigger for us to be looking for. Now, that little drab that we just did finishes up the passage in Luke that we didn't get to last time. So now let's look at some additional passages in all three of the synoptic gospel versions of the Olivet Discourse. We'll begin with Matthew, then do Mark, then do Luke. Matthew 24:32. Now let the fig tree teach you its lesson. When its branches begin to sprout and leaves appear, you know that summer is approaching. In the same way, when you see all these things, you are to know that the time is near, right at the door. Yes, I tell you that this people will certainly not pass away before all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. All right, next. Mark 13:28. Now let the fig tree teach you its lesson. When its branches begin to sprout and leaves appear, you know that summer is approaching. In the same way, when you see all these things happening, these are things that are going to begin to take place at the end of the age. In the same way, when you see all these things happening, you are to know that the time is near, right at the door. It's going to be like when we see the fig tree branches beginning to sprout leaves. We know that there's a cycle that's going to go through. Verse 30, yes, I tell you that this people will certainly not pass away before all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will certainly not pass away. Now next, Luke 21:29. Then he told them a parable. Well, what we've read in the last two versions in Matthew and Mark were both parables. Luke just simply points that out. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree. Indeed, all of the trees, that's added. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things taking place, you are to know that the kingdom of God is near. Yes, I tell you that this people will certainly not pass away before it has all happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will certainly not pass away. Well, these passages are substantially identical, so we can really discuss them as a unit. We can see that, for the most part, all three of these versions are the same. It's interesting that this statement about the fig tree is referred to as a parable. You know, a parable is used in a very general sense here as an instructive comparison, and that's what a parable is. It gives us something that we can use as a comparison to what is being taught scripturally. That comparison is with the fig tree. Out of all the trees Yeshua could have chosen, he chose the fig tree, and in Luke it is added all the trees, which is interesting. But remember that each of these Gospels is written for a different audience. Each of these Gospels was written for a different audience with different backgrounds for that writer to work with. A strict interpretation here would cause us to understand that Yeshua is talking about trees in general and that the parable is about the approach of summer, and it's talking about the budding of leaves. So will it be with the events in those preceding verses, the signs of the approach of the kingdom. With their budding, they're going to be building up just like leaves on a tree, building up to the actual return of Messiah to set up his kingdom. This is actually what David Stern says in his Jewish New Testament commentary, so let's don't take it any further than that. That's all that this parable means. When you see leaves budding on the trees, it means summer is at hand. When you see panic and terror among unbelievers at things they can't control or fathom, it means the kingdom of God is at hand. The parable with the trees is just a reinforcing concept, if you will, an instructive comparison. But then there's another body of thought that there is really a deeper meaning to this. Because of the choice of the fig tree, there's a deeper meaning of this. And I believe that it's well-founded, that the fig tree represents the people Israel as a nation, set by God in the land of Israel to glorify him. So we have this fig tree, the nation of Israel, in the land planted by God to glorify him. And when we see the fig tree budding, when we see Israel in the land, understand the comparison there. When we see the fig tree budding, when we see Israel in the land, know that the kingdom of God is at hand. So 1948 was a big deal. Suddenly, Israel's back in the land. The fig tree is budding. Now, this doesn't necessarily conflict with the first interpretation that we looked at. This interpretation can even be taken in conjunction with that first interpretation, really without causing any kind of conflict. This would be the revival of Jews as a nation that we're talking about here when we see Israel in the land, the fig tree budding. This would be the revival of Jews as a nation, and what is inferred by Yeshua here would be essentially watch Israel and watch the movements among the nations, with the fig tree representing Israel and the phrase all of the trees representing the Gentile nations. Watch the fig tree and watch the rest of the trees, because it's a parabolic thing laid out for us to pay attention to. So, I would say that's also a valid interpretation, particularly in view of recent history. And I mean, look at the events of recent weeks. It would seem that this additional interpretation has credibility, and we shouldn't ignore it. We probably really shouldn't try to view the two interpretations side by side where other has to be selected, but as superimposing that information of each of them on each of the other ones. When you see these things happening, you will know that the kingdom of God is at the door. Now, on to Matthew 24, verses 34 through 35, please. Yes, I tell you that this people will certainly not pass away before all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. This has been the focus of quite a bit of controversy. Hang on to these words that are just said here. Some translations use the term generations. I tell you that this generation will certainly not pass away. Some people use other terms, but the Complete Jewish Bible uses people, which I think is a good translation. Here again, there are two interpretations that are worthy of consideration. Yeshua starts this with a very marked emphasis and in a very solemn manner. Some translations even say, I solemnly declare, instead of, yes, I tell you. The NIV of in all three Gospels says, I tell you the truth. I tell you the truth. Complete Jewish Bible here says, yes, I tell you. Then what is said is, this people. So what's meant by this verse? One thing, it doesn't mean all of mankind are all believers. It doesn't mean that. In context, this people is speaking of the Jewish people, an identifiable people who are recognized as Jews. This people will certainly not pass away before all of these things have happened. In other words, in spite of everything that Satan tries until this point we're at right now, they're not going to be able to get rid of the Jews. Now, the two most serious interpretations that people make of this passage are one, and this one I don't feel is correct at all. Everybody alive at the time of the statement, in other words, everybody alive at the time Yeshua is giving this, which would be around the year 30, the generation of the Talmudim that walked with Yeshua shall not have died out by the time this prophecy is fulfilled. This interprets this people as those being alive at that time, and all these things have to happen, in this case, referring to specifically Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, was that's picked out. Now, number two, the other interpretation construes this people as Jews alive at the end. Jews alive at the end. All these things that happen includes all of the events prophesied for that time, the time of the end, including the second coming. All the prophetic prophecies will have happened is speaking the things of the end times. Now we know that Judah was crushed and dispersed as a political entity or nation by the Romans. It ceased to be, basically, as a nation in 135 Common Era. This lasted a little over 1,900 years until 1948. 1947, 48, depends on how you want to declare it. 47, the UN said, yes, you can be a nation. 48, Israel declared, we are a nation. But history has proven to us the Jews as an identifiable people continued to exist in every age between 135 Common Era and 1948. And in our lifetime have again become a political entity. We have the nation Israel, existing in the same sense as it did when Yeshua gave these words. Actually at a higher sovereign level, if you want to consider that, actually at a higher sovereign level than when Yeshua gave these words, because when he gave these words, they were under Rome's control. Today, they're under their own control. The UN is, at least at this point, still less politically repressive on Israel than Rome was back then. There's a story of a king of England who was on his deathbed. The year of that story is 1100 to 1200. He's laying there knowing he has only a few minutes to live, and in those last few minutes of life, he's overcome with anxiety and apprehension. Everybody that was important was there, all these relatives, politicians, the church leaders, and the king grasped the hand of the bishop, and he asks in a stricken voice, how can I know it's true? How can I know that everything that this Bible is telling me is true? What he's saying here is, I know what the scriptures say, but what can I look at as evidence in my lifetime and know for sure that these scriptures are true? And the bishop answers him, what you need to look at, my Lord, is the Jew. The Jews are still here. It's as simple as that. You see, when Yeshua said these words, Satan was intent on trying to eliminate the Jew from the face of the earth. If the Jew could be eliminated from the face of the earth, then these words wouldn't be true anymore. Verse 35 is one of those passages that can be used when someone wants to tell what a good and great man Yeshua was, what a great teacher. All the good things that he did, what a great leader he was, what a great person he was. These are all statements that are really falling short of his divine nature. But people will do those things. But if we want to know what a great and good man he was, then we have to recognize his divine nature, which people commonly fail to do. Most of the groups who don't believe that he was the Son of God will admit that he was wonderful, that the ministry that he did was great. He was a great prophet. He was all of this. But, yes, he was great. He was all of the above and more. He was the greatest person, in my opinion, that ever lived. Now, these passages that we've been looking at are all good because what he says is heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. These are words of absolute authority. These are words of absolute authority. The type and kind of authority that only one who himself is God, one that is one with the Father, could utter, because anyone else speaking these words would be an arrogant, boasting liar, because they couldn't pull it off. Or they'd be insane, totally psychotic. He has to be one or the other. He's either God, they're speaking of Yeshua, he has to be either one or the other. Either he's God or he's a nutcase. That's simple. This is also a great passage for doubters to play with. Here Yeshua guarantees that everything will be fulfilled as an absolute certainty. He's not merely foretelling the course of history, but in unity with the Father and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, he is here being the author of history. See, he and the Father and the Ruach together are the ones who determine history. Even the existence of heaven and earth are only as sure as the words of Yeshua. Everything will be fulfilled. So think about verse 35. When someone sets out to tell you what a wonderful person this Yeshua was, but denies divinity, think of this verse 35, and you can whoop up on them. This passage is really not paralleled in Luke or Mark, either one, except for Mark 13:32, which is essentially the same as Matthew 24:36, which we're going to begin reading right now. Matthew 24:36, please. But when that day and hour come, no one knows, not the angels in heaven, not the Son, only the Father, for the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. Think that about. Look at verse 37 again. For the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. Back then, before the flood, the people went on eating and drinking, taking wives, becoming wives, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. See, things are going to go on just as normal among most of the world. They're not going to be paying attention. Next. And, speaking of the days of Noah, and they didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. It will be just like that when the Son of Man comes. Then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and the other left behind. There will be two women grinding flour at a mill. One will be taken and the other left behind. Wow. Matthew 24:36 and Mark 13:32 tell us several things. One of these things is that those who pursue the science of numbers and various schemes and irrefutable logic, calculating the date and time of Yeshua's return well in advance, will in all cases be wrong. Just as simple as that. You're not going to be able to do it on your own. So when somebody comes to you and says he's approaching on March 31st at 2 p.m., sell all your possessions, give the money to me, go up on the mountain and wait for him, don't believe him. Because of that day and hour, no man knows at this point where Yeshua is giving this. Yes, we do know today that it will be Yom Teruah, but what year? When it is close, though, it will be obvious to us because of the way that the things are going on in the world. But the world will be out there eating and drinking as in the days of Noah, not paying a bit of attention to everything that's going down. They're going to be totally ignorant. See, this verse is a warning. This verse is a warning, but people just don't pay attention. There was a group here in Lee County, and I don't know if any of the rest of you have been here long enough to remember this or not, but there was a group here in Lee County 35 years or so ago. I don't remember exactly, but there were some people from Sanibel involved. Anyhow, they got involved with a lady guru of some sort that was playing divination. And these people, at her word, at her saying, sold all their holdings and moved to the Ozarks of Arkansas because she had told them it was time for Messiah to return and he would pick them off that particular mountain in Arkansas. There was one fence rider in that group that sold but didn't move to the exact location the rest of the group did. I have no idea why. If you're going to sell and move to a mountain in Arkansas, why not go with the crowd? Anyhow, my best guess is any of them that haven't caught on yet may still be there. Now, more recently, and this is, I think, as crazy as what we just looked at, more recently, a lot of people paid huge amounts of money just in rents to the Arabs to be on the Mount of Olives for the dawning of the new millennium, the year 2001, January 1st, which had to be it, the time of return, according to their theology and all that they'd worked out. And that would have placed them at the epicenter of the greatest earth-moving phenomenon ever if they had been there on the Mount of Olives waiting for him to come back. Because when the Mount of Olives splits in half, when Yeshua's foot touches down, one side moving north and the other side to the south, that's not a place that you want to be. You want to be up in front of the Temple Mount to greet him. People just don't pay attention. particularly when their own wants and wishes aren't being taken care of. Only the Father, at the moment Yeshua spoke, knew the day and the hour. There is a prohibition against such practices as naming the day. It's there. People who do this are not only wrong, but are operating really against God's will. Now, it's also interesting that only the Father knew at the time Yeshua spoke of this, not the angels, not even the Son. This is a matter that's really beyond comprehension. I mean, created spiritual beings like angels not knowing is one thing, because angels don't know a lot. If they did, half of them wouldn't have followed Satan. But the Son not knowing. But remember, Yeshua had emptied himself. Part of his taking on this ministry was to empty himself. The fact that Messiah's return will happen at a specific moment within the fabric of time, though, is absolute. It's absolute. But again, what about the Son? What about the Son? See, that causes a problem in some people's minds. Some scholars have tried to explain this away. That what was Yeshua's purpose in this statement that the Son didn't even know when he was going to come back at this point? And Yeshua's purpose in this statement was not to define the limits of his knowledge, but to stress that vigilance and not calculation is required if the required attitude of mind is to be reached. Anyhow, the thought being that the approach of Yeshua's return is impossible to discern from a distance and so prepare oneself for it. We're not going to be able to figure this out way ahead of time. If we did, if we knew it was coming, everybody would get real nice, wouldn't they? Just like the kids do just before Christmas time. Return will be so sudden and unexpected that requiring vigilance and confident faith must be the rule of the day instead of calculation. Now, that's one theory that people have developed in regard to this. But there's another one. Always another one, isn't there? This other one, Philippians 2, 6, and 7, really, I believe, sheds some light on this. Let's go there. Though he was in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God something to be possessed by force. On the contrary, he emptied himself, in that he took the form of a slave by becoming a human like human beings are. And when he appeared as a human being, he humbled himself still more by becoming obedient even to death on a stake as a criminal. So here we have the actual passage telling us that Yeshua emptied himself, became like human beings are. Well, if you add that to the mix, then we have something different. Yeshua was the Son of God. He said, the Father and I are one. If you've seen me, you have seen the Father. Before Abraham was, I am. Well, then they picked up stones, the people that were listening to him preach all of this stuff on the Temple Mount. They picked up stones to kill him for saying he was God. Judeans on the Temple Mount recognized that statement immediately. But he, Yeshua, emptied himself and became like a human being. And that's all really incomprehensible to us, if you think about it. Only the Father knows the day and the hour of my return, not the angels of heaven, not even the Son, at the time he spoke this. Someday, when we get the chance, we're going to have to ask Yeshua, how did you really do that? How did you really empty yourself and all that? And he can tell us. Other than that, here are these two theories. After this warning, the following verses in Matthew give us info on the time of the second coming of the Son of Man. After this warning, the following verses in Matthew give us info on the time of the second coming of the Son of Man. Verse 37, it says, it will be like the days of Noah. Remember that? So, what were the predominant features of the days of Noah? Let's go to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, and then we'll skip ahead to verses 11 through 13. Genesis 6:5, Adonai saw that the people on earth were very wicked, that all the imaginings of their hearts were always evil only. Verse 11, the earth was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. God saw the earth, and yes, it was corrupt, for all living beings had corrupted their ways on earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all living things has come before me, for because of them the earth is filled with violence. I will destroy them along with the earth. We need to apply this to what Yeshua has said. But first, I want to expand on it just a little bit. Some translations use wickedness and some have evil. People of the earth were in wickedness. The people on earth were very evil. This is really the same word in Hebrew. Then there's violence. Then there's violence. There's corruption. And we need to define these. Wickedness or evil, the general meaning is being impious or ungodly. Being impious or ungodly. The people had become impious and ungodly. They weren't paying any attention. But this is defined really by its effect. As we work our way through this list of things, think of some of the sitcoms that we're now seeing on TV commonly. What's coming across our movie screens, what we hear on the radio, what we read in books like Harry Potter. We got to think about all this as it applies to our time. So at Noah's time, the earth was filled with people who were very wicked. It would be a place that was restless, in an unquieted state, if you will. A place tossed by evil passions, a distraction with various forms of evil, a having of no conscience or peace, the opposite of being in a state of quiet, a place where it is possible to confound being just and unjust. That's what the world was like. It was a place where it was possible to confound being just and unjust, truth and falsehood, good and evil. People couldn't separate those out. To think and act as if there was no difference of persons or things or actions, resulting in the throwing of human affairs into the greatest confusion at all. And we can see that our world today is moving very quickly in that direction if we're not almost there now. At least we old folks can see it, because we have a basis for comparison that unfortunately the younger generation doesn't have. What about violence? Well, violence is to oppress, to wrong, to act violently in a word or deed in any respect against truth, right and justice and goodness. That is violence. What about corruption? Corruption leads to destroying, to ruin, to lay in ruins, to pervert, to despoil, to make for nothing, to corrupt wisdom, to pervert it to the purpose of craftiness and deceit. Moral corruption is loss of integrity, loss of virtue. This is it was at the time of Noah. So you can see it wasn't a very nice place. Now hold your place here, if you're in the Bible. Then Yeshua goes on to say in Matthew 24:38, back then, before the flood, people went on eating and drinking, taking wives and becoming wives, right up till the day Noah entered the ark. And they didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. It will be just like that when the Son of Man comes. Notice what happens. We're going back to Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. Adonai said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone in this generation are righteous before me. Of every clean animal you are to take 7 couples, and of the animals that are not clean 1 couple. Also of the birds of the air take 7 couples in order to preserve their species throughout the earth. For in 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. I will wipe out every living thing that I have made from the face of the earth. So, one of the apparent messages of Matthew 24:38 that we just read is the world will have the same blindness at the end of time that the world had at the time of Noah. Note that in this example of Noah, that all during the building of the ark, which took 120 years, the people had a visible witness of something about to happen. Even a final 7 days of warning before the disaster while Noah loaded the ark. Some entrepreneurs probably organized guided tours out to see this wacko, what he was doing, building this great big boat at a time when it had never rained. Think about it. Before the flood, the earth was watered by heavy dew. It had never rained, and that heavy dew was preserved, the moisture of it was preserved by a cloud cover, the same greenhouse effect that we're being taught that we should be afraid of today. They saw Noah go into the ark and the doors sealed. It says at the end of Genesis 7:16, Adonai shut him inside. So they, the worldly, had a final warning, but too late. The worldly, I believe, are going to get a final warning in this current age, but too late. Once the door of the ark is closed and sealed, that's it. And Yeshua says this is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The world reaction will be the same way. The people of the world will be oblivious, too engrossed in what they're doing to pay attention to what God is doing. What's going on in the spiritual realm. They're not going to be interested at all in what's going on in the spiritual realm if it doesn't help make the payments on the Cadillac. Why is that? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 2:14, please. Now the natural man does not receive the things from the Spirit of God. To him they're nonsense. No paying attention to what's going on with God. Moreover, he is unable to grasp them, things of the Spirit of God, because they are evaluated through the Spirit, and he doesn't have the Spirit. Interesting. Now, there's a repetition plainly in this statement, so also will it be at the coming of the Son of Man, the emphasis on the condition of the world at the time of Yeshua's second coming. Being like the condition of the world at the time Noah entered the ark, these two times will be substantially identical in both moral and spiritual sense. The morals will be corrupted, and there will be no spiritual discernment among the masses. But notice there will be a social fabric of sorts. There will be a social fabric of sorts. People will be getting married and being given in marriage. There'll still be believers present on the earth at the time of Yeshua's return comes into place. So there will be a sort of a social fabric, but there will be this corruption, this wickedness, this violence over the face of the earth. And I'm going to tell you that from the time I was a boy, the world has become extraordinarily more violent and corrupt and overtly corrupt, if I will, than I remember it being as a young man. I can remember my mother and I, when my dad was in chiropractic college, going up to Forest Park in South St. Louis on a Sunday afternoon, staying there till after dark and walking back home, including walking across the end of a rail yard, with no fear for our lives. Today, you wouldn't walk through Forest Park unless you had 10 armed men with you. Literally. I know that the good days were better because now that I'm here, I can see that the old days were better. Today you can get a shot at blowing your horn at somebody. You can get shot at for blowing your horn at somebody. You can get shot at for flashing your lights at someone driving with their high beams on. Matthew 24, verse 40. Then there will be 2 men in a field. One will be taken, the other will be left behind. There will be 2 women grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken, the other will be left behind. This focuses on the day of Yeshua's return. Now, some interpret this to mean that one will be taken to be with the Lord and the other left behind. Some interpret this to mean that one will be taken to be with the Lord, the other left behind. The one left behind being left to everlasting perdition. This is a very popular today. There's books and there's movies. This is a view held by those that think there's a rapture, be it pre, mid, post, or variations of those. But there's also a second view, that those that are taken to be judged by God. And those left are the believers that remain on the planet to enter the millennium with the Messiah as he returns. Why should anybody possibly have such a rash thought as that? Well, let's look at Matthew chapter 13, verse 24. Yeshua put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. That's talking about God planting his people on the earth and Satan coming along and planting the evil ones with them. All right. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads of grain, the weeds also appeared, and the owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field?" Asking God, "Didn't you do this right? Where have the weeds come from?" Next. He answered, "An enemy has done this." The servants asked him, and pay attention to this, "Then do you want us to go and pull them up?" No. But he said, "No. Because if you pull up the weeds, you might uproot some of the wheat at the same time. Let them both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first." I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first and tie them in bundles to be burned, but to gather the wheat into my barn, to leave it on the earth. Starting in Matthew 13:24, Yeshua starts to tell a parable about the tares in the wheat, the weeds in the wheat. Where'd these weeds come from? The enemy planted them. Shall we pull them up now? No. The good harvest might be harmed as well if you do that now. Let them mature, let them both grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first. Tie them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat, the good crop, into my barn. Has that got our attention? Now, back to Matthew 24:40. And really the explanation to the parable fits into place. There will be two men in the field. One will be taken and the other left behind. There will be two women grinding flour to mill. One will be taken and the other left behind. So stay alert, because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. See? But you do know this. Had the owner of the house known when the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not allowed his house to be broken into. So the two men are in the field. One is taken, one is left. There are a lot of people out there that think this is the rapture. I don't think so. I think that this is speaking of a time when the good crop remains going into the kingdom of Messiah. I wonder if the barn there is synonymous with the chuppah and the sukkah of Isaiah 4:2-6, please. On that day, that's the day of the return, Adonai's plant will be beautiful and glorious. Adonai's plant is the fig tree. And the fruit of the land will be the pride and splendor of Israel's survivors. That will be those that are left after the evil ones are taken out. Those left in Zion and remaining in Jerusalem will be called holy. That's the ones that are left after those are taken out. And everyone in Jerusalem written down for life. Verse 4, when Adonai washes away the filth of the women of Zion and cleanses Jerusalem from the blood shed in it with a searing blast of judgment. Next. Adonai will create over the whole site of Mount Zion, over those who assemble there, a smoking cloud by day, a shining flaming fire by night, for the glory will be over everything like a chuppah. That's the cloud that God is going to be coming down over Mount Zion in Jerusalem. It will cover everything like a chuppah. A chuppah is that cloth that we hold up over the kids when we give a blessing to them. That's what a chuppah is. The blessing is going to be coming from above that. Verse 6, it'll be like a sukkah. A sukkah will give shade by day from the heat. It will also provide refuge and cover from storm and rain. That's why we have Sukkot. at the end of the passage of the end of the age. Remember that Yeshua is talking to the Jews here in the Olivet Discourse. What's Adonai's plant? The fig tree, the people of Israel. Those that are left will be holy. Everyone left written in the book of life will be gathered under this great cloud flashing with fire that is over Zion, over Jerusalem, the land. It's the huppah, the sukkah. That sukkah is the barn that the good crop is gathered into in Matthew 13. Whatever it is, it's going to happen in a blink, like the sound of the door on the ark when it's slammed shut. Now, let's go into Luke 31:24, please. 31:34 through 36. But keep watch on yourselves, or your hearts will become dulled by carousing and drunkenness, and the worries of everyday living in that day will be sprung upon you suddenly like a trap. Why will it be sprung on you like a trap? Because your hearts have been dulled by carousing and drunkenness and worries about everyday living instead of paying attention to what God's doing. For it will close in on everyone, no matter where they live, throughout the whole world. Throughout the whole world. Stay alert, always praying that you will have strength to escape all the things that will happen and to stand in the presence of the Son of Man. Luke gives us a little different look at this. Additional material not seen in Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark speak of watchfulness, be constantly alert, be constantly thoughtful that coming day. Always be vigilant, have an attitude that promotes a sanctified life and moral cautiousness. Live a careful, prudent lifestyle as opposed to trying to figure out the time and the hour of the return. Luke's attention is on living the kind of life that will leave you prepared, and he is talking to believers. This is meant for all believers. See, not just those in the last days. See, in a real sense, Yeshua is constantly coming into the life of every believer, particularly at the time of their death, just like he will be at the time of the end. At the time of death, a person's fate is sealed, just as it will be for those still alive at his return in that twinkling. Messianic Jews 9:27, please. Just as human beings have to die once, but after this comes the judgment. Those who believe in reincarnation, take note. The fact is, all are called upon to live continually, as if at any moment to expect his coming and a final judgment. Back in Luke 21, verse 35, for it will close in on everyone, no matter where they live, throughout the whole world. This is talking about this end happening. Stay alert, always praying that you will have strength to escape all the things that will happen and to stand in the presence of the Son of God. Wow. Verse 35, it shows Messiah's return will not just affect certain people like the Jews in Jerusalem. It's going to be universal. Global in nature. It will finally and forever determine the destiny of every individual. Verse 36 is a caution to be constantly alert against sin, so that one doesn't stray in his heart or in his life. And it's interesting here that prayer is the means by which one can stand firm against all temptations. The distress and the struggle that will accompany the end. Prayer is what you need to be involved in. This phrase, all the things that will happen, the phrase ends with a view of what it will be like on that day, being able to stand before the Son of Man as one of his redeemed and not shrink away from him in shame. Think of that. Think of that. Standing in the presence of the Son of Man, who will have returned in all of his glory, and not shrink away from him because of any shame. See, that's what he wants us prepared for. And we'll close with that and return next week to start in Revelation.